The Mississippi River in the 1850s was not just a river. It was a vein that pumped life and death through the entire American South. And on its western bank, just above the city of Natchez, where the bluffs rise high above the water like the walls of a cathedral built by God himself, there stood a property that the locals whispered about but never dared to visit uninvited. They called it Beaumont Hall. And if you had driven past it on a hot July afternoon, you would have seen something that looked like a dream. White columns stretching toward the sky. A wraparound porch so wide you could park a carriage on it. Magnolia trees so old their branches touched the ground like the fingers of giants praying. The lawn was cut so perfectly it looked like green velvet laid by hand. And beyond the house, row after row of cottons stretched to the horizon, white and fluffy under the brutal sun, worth more than gold in those days. But if you had walked around to the back of that house, past the smokehouse, past the cotton gin, past the rows of slave cabins that looked more like animal pens than homes, you would have seen something else entirely. A brick structure, small, low, almost hidden between two oak trees that had grown so twisted and dark they looked like they were trying to strangle the building. There was no sign, no name, but every enslaved person on that plantation knew exactly what it was. And they had a name for it too. They called it the Devil's Mouth. This is the story of Beaumont Hall, of the man who built it, of the people he destroyed, and of the night when everything changed. Harlan Beaumont was not born into wealth. That is important to understand, because the myth he spent his whole life building was that he was a self-made man, a Southern gentleman who pulled himself up from nothing. And in a way, that part was true. He was born in 1808, in a dirt floor cabin outside of Charleston, South Carolina. His father was a failed tobacco farmer who drank more than he worked. His mother died when Harlan was 9, of a fever that no doctor in the county could treat. By the time he was 14, he was alone, surviving on scraps, sleeping in barns, doing odd jobs for whoever would feed him. But Harlan had something that most poor boys in that era did not have. He had a mind that never stopped calculating. Even as a teenager, he could look at a piece of land and tell you exactly how much cotton it would produce. He could look at a man and tell you exactly what that man wanted to hear. And he had a cruelty in him that was not learned but born, like a second heartbeat. Neighbors would later say that even as a boy, he would catch birds and not kill them quickly. He would take his time. In 1832, at 24 years old, Harlan Beaumont arrived in Natchez, Mississippi, with $11 in his pocket and a letter of introduction to a cotton broker named Josiah Whitfield. Natchez in those days was the richest city per capita in the entire United States. The cotton barons lived like kings. They built mansions that rivaled anything in Europe. They threw parties that lasted 3 days. And they needed men like Harlan, men who were hungry enough to do whatever it took to climb. Within 5 years, Beaumont had worked his way from a clerk in Whitfield's office to owning his own plantation. How? That is a question historians have debated for over a century. The official story is that he saved every cent, invested wisely, and bought land cheap after the Panic of 1837. But the unofficial story, the one told in whispers by the old black families of Adams County, is different. They say Harlan cheated. They say he forged documents. They say he bought a man's land for a fraction of its value by threatening to have the man's enslaved workers sold downriver, which in those days was essentially a death sentence. Whatever the truth, by 1838, Harlan Beaumont owned 400 acres of prime Mississippi bottomland and 47 enslaved people. That was the year he built Beaumont Hall. The house was designed by a New Orleans architect named Pierre Dupuy, who had built half the great mansions along the river. 2 stories. Greek Revival style, 6 white columns across the front, each one 30 feet tall, imported from a quarry in Vermont at a cost that could have fed every enslaved person on the plantation for a year. The front door was made of mahogany from Honduras. The floors were heart pine, hand-planed. The wallpaper in the parlor was French silk, printed with scenes of the Louvre. Every detail screamed money. Every detail screamed power. And in 1840, Harlan married Catherine Ashford. She was 22, the daughter of Senator Edward Ashford of Louisiana, a man who sat in the United States Senate and voted to protect slavery every single time it came up. Catherine was beautiful in the way Southern women were expected to be beautiful. Blonde, blue-eyed, soft-spoken. She played the piano. She embroidered. She smiled at the right people and looked away from the wrong things. She married Harlan because father told her to. And for the first few years, she genuinely believed she had married a good man. The parties at Beaumont Hall became legendary. Planters from 3 states would come for the weekends. There was whiskey that flowed like water. There was gambling in the back parlor that went on until dawn. There were enslaved musicians playing fiddle and banjo while the white guests danced on the porch under the magnolias. And Catherine would sit at the head of the table in her silk dress, smiling, pouring wine, playing the perfect hostess. But behind the columns, behind the silk wallpaper, behind the smile, something dark was growing. The brick building in the back of the property had originally been a sugarcane processing oven. When Beaumont first bought the land, he had briefly tried to grow sugar cane alongside cotton, following a trend among Mississippi planters who wanted to diversify. The oven was built in 1836 by a German bricklayer named Friedrich Keller, who reportedly said when he finished the job the structure was too perfect for sugar. He meant it as a compliment. He had no idea what it would become. The sugar experiment failed. The soil was wrong. The oven sat empty for 2 years. And then Harlan Beaumont found a new use for it. The first person known to have been put inside the devil's mouth was an enslaved man named Peter. He was 26 years old, strong, and he had done something that in the eyes of Harlan Beaumont was unforgivable. He had spoken back, not shouted, not struck. He had simply looked the coronel in the eye during a whipping and said, "You are not master. God is my master." That was enough. Peter was dragged to the oven at night. The overseer, a man named Taggart who had the reputation of being the cruelest white man in Adams County, ordered the fire lit. Not a ring fire, a slow, smoldering heat, the kind that does not kill quickly, the kind that makes you wish it would. Peter was inside for what witnesses later described as a long time. When they finally pulled him out, he was alive but barely. His skin was blistered from his feet to his shoulders. He could not speak for the rest of his life. He lived another 11 years, working in the fields with hands that were permanently curled into claws, never complaining, never looking anyone in the eye again. And that was just the beginning. Over the next 17 years, the devil's mouth was used on an estimated 140 people. Men, women, some as young as 13. The punishments varied. Sometimes it was for attempted escape. Sometimes it was for working too slowly. Sometimes it was for breaking a tool. Sometimes, and this is the part that turns your stomach, it was for no reason at all. Harlan would wake up in a mood. He would walk through the cabins, point at someone and say, "Take him to the oven." No trial, no explanation, just a finger and a sentence. The enslaved people developed a language around it. They never said the word oven. They said the walking, as in, he got the walking. They never said Beaumont's name out loud near the house. They called him the architect, because he had built something, and that something was designed to break human beings. And then there was old Solomon. Solomon was brought to Beaumont Hall in 1841, sold from a plantation in Virginia by a man who said Solomon was too old to work and too stubborn to sell for a good price. He was perhaps 50 years old when he arrived. Thin, gray-bearded, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a sawmill accident years before. Beaumont looked at him and said, "He's worthless. Put him in the fields anyway." Solomon worked in the cotton fields for 16 years. He was never whipped. Not because Beaumont was merciful, but because Solomon had learned something that most enslaved people never figured out. He learned to be invisible. He worked just fast enough. He never looked up. He never spoke unless spoken to. He ate his cornbread in silence. He slept in the corner of his cabin farthest from the door. And he watched. God, how he watched. Solomon saw everything. He saw Peter taken to the oven. He saw a young woman named Ruth, who was pregnant, put inside for spilling soup on Catherine's dress. He saw a boy of 14, named Josiah, who tried to run away and was brought back with both legs broken, dragged to the oven while the other enslaved people were forced to watch. Solomon saw all of it, and he remembered all of it. In 1853, Solomon was sent to the oven for the first time. The reason was that he had accidentally broken a hoe. Just a hoe. Taggart, the overseer, decided it was sabotage. Solomon was pushed inside. The fire was lit. And for reasons that no one could explain, Solomon survived. They pulled him out after what must have been hours. His back was burned so badly that the skin hung in sheets. But he was alive. His eyes were damaged, but he could still see shapes. They sent him back to the fields. He worked for another 2 years, half-blind, in agony. And then, in 1855, he was sent again. This time for stealing a piece of bacon. Piece of bacon. Solomon went into the oven a second time. When they pulled him out, he was completely blind. The heat had destroyed what little sight he had left. But Solomon did not die. And here is where the story takes a turn that even the cruelest men in Adams County could not ignore. A blind man, burned beyond recognition, should have been left to die in his cabin. But Solomon refused to die. He sat up. He asked for water. And the next morning, he was back in the cotton field, guided by other enslaved people working by feel, pulling cotton with hands that were more scar tissue than skin. And then, in the spring of 1857, Solomon was sent to the oven a third time. The reason this time was that he had been overheard humming a spiritual. Just humming. A low, quiet tune. Wade in the water. Taggart heard it and reported it to Beaumont. Beaumont said, "Take him." This time, when they pulled Solomon out, he was not just blind. He was deaf in one ear. His lungs were damaged. He coughed blood for weeks. The other enslaved people whispered that Solomon had been to the mouth of hell 3 times and hell had not wanted him. Some of them started calling him prophet, not because he preached, but because he survived what should have killed any man 3 times over, and that had to mean something. Solomon could not see. He could barely hear. But his mind was sharper than ever. And he began to do something that no one expected. He started talking. Not to the white people. Never to them. He talked to the young ones. The ones who had just arrived at Beaumont Hall and did not yet know what the devil's mouth was. He would sit outside his cabin in the evenings, and the young enslaved people would gather around him, and he would tell them. Not in a whisper. In a normal voice. He told them about Peter. About Ruth. About little Josiah with the broken legs. He told them about the oven. He told them everything. And he told them something else. He told them that the man who built that oven was not a god. He was a man. And men can be stopped. Now, I need to pause here for a moment, because what you have heard so far is just the surface. What is coming next is where this story stops being a history lesson and becomes something else entirely. Something that will make you sit up straight in your chair. So before we go any further, I want to hear from you. What do you think so far? Do you think Solomon was right? Can a man who has been broken 3 times still find the strength to fight back? Drop your thoughts in the comments right now. I read every single one. And trust me, what comes next will make you want to come back and tell me I was right. Catherine Ashford Beaumont knew. That is the part of the story that most people do not talk about. She knew about the oven. She knew about Peter. She knew about Ruth. She knew about Josiah. She knew because she was not as blind as she pretended to be. For years, Catherine lived in what historians would later call strategic ignorance. She told herself that what happened in the back of the plantation was not her concern. That Harlan was a hard man but a fair one. That the enslaved people were well-fed and clothed, at least compared to other plantations. She poured the wine. She smiled at the guests. She played the piano. And every night, when the house was quiet, she lay in her 4-poster bed with silk sheets and stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about the sounds she sometimes heard from the direction of the brick building. The turning point came in the winter of 1856. Catherine's personal maid, a young woman named Clara, came to her one morning with her sleeves rolled up. Clara was 19. She had been with Catherine since she was a child, given to her as a wedding gift by her father. And on her arms, from wrist to elbow, were burns. Old burns. Some of them infected, some of them still weeping. Catherine stared at those arms for a long time. And then she said, very quietly, "Who did this to you?" Clara looked at the floor. "The architect," she whispered. Catherine did not scream. She did not cry. She sat down on the edge of her bed, and for the first time in 16 years of marriage, she saw her husband clearly. Not the man who brought her flowers, not the man who danced with her at the Christmas ball. The man who burned a 19-year-old girl because she dropped a teacup. She confronted him that night. They were in the parlor after guests had left. Catherine stood by the fireplace, and Harlan sat in his leather chair with a glass of bourbon. She said, "I know about the oven, Harlan. I know what you do. I know about Clara." Harlan did not flinch. He took a sip of his drink. And then he said something that Catherine would remember for the rest of her life. He said, "You are my wife. You will sit in this house and you will smile at my guests and you will say nothing. Because if you open your mouth, you go back to your father's house without a cent, without the children, and without a name. And I will tell everyone you went mad. Do you understand me?" Catherine understood. She sat down. She poured herself a glass of wine. And she said nothing. But something had changed. The next morning, Catherine did something she had never done before. She walked to the back of the plantation, past the smokehouse, past the cotton gin, past the cabins. She walked all the way to the brick building. She stood in front of it. The door was open. Inside, she could see the blackened walls, the iron grate where people had been chained, the ash pit in the floor. The smell hit her like a wall. Burned flesh, old and new. She stood there for perhaps 10 minutes. And then she turned around and walked back to the house. And from that day forward, Catherine Ashford Beaumont was no longer the same woman. She began to notice things. She began to listen. She began to see the enslaved people not as furniture but as human beings. And slowly, very slowly, she began to plan. It was in this atmosphere, this powder keg of cruelty and quiet rebellion, that a new man arrived at Beaumont Hall in March of 1857. His name was Isaiah. He was sold from a plantation in Richmond, Virginia, by a man named Colonel Whitfield, no relation to the Natchez broker. The bill of sale said he was 34 years old, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, literate. The word literate was underlined twice, which in the antebellum South was not a compliment. It was a warning. A man who could read was a man who could think. A man who could think was a man who could plan. And a man who could plan was dangerous. Isaiah had been born into slavery in Virginia, the son of an enslaved woman and, it was rumored, the son of the plantation owner himself. He never knew his father. His mother taught him to read using a Bible that she hid under her mattress, risking her life every night to teach her son the alphabet by candlelight. By the time he was 12, Isaiah could read the Bible cover to cover. By 15, he could read newspapers. By 20, he was teaching other enslaved people to read in secret, meeting in the woods on Sunday nights, using charcoal on pieces of bark as writing tools. His old master in Virginia found out. The punishment was severe. Isaiah was whipped until the whip broke. Then they used a leather strap. Then they sent him to the county jail for 3 months, chained to a wall. When he came back, he was quieter. But not broken. Never broken. Colonel Whitfield sold him because he said Isaiah had the look of a man who was waiting. Whitfield did not want to wait. He wanted Isaiah gone. So Isaiah arrived at Beaumont Hall on a Tuesday in March 1857, chained to 4 other men, walked up the dirt road from the Natchez Landing, and was handed over to Taggart, the overseer, who looked him up and down and said, "Another one. Put him in the East Field." Isaiah went to the East Field. He picked cotton. He did not look up. He did not speak. For 3 weeks he was invisible, just like Solomon had taught himself to be. But Isaiah was not Solomon. Solomon had learned to survive by disappearing. Isaiah had learned to survive by watching and waiting and calculating. And he was doing all 3. Every night, after the other enslaved people fell asleep, Isaiah lay in his cot and thought. He mapped the plantation in his mind. He counted the overseers. He noted the patrol routes. He watched when the gates were locked and when they were not. He listened to the conversations of the white men during meals, because enslaved people were expected to serve at the table and hear everything and say nothing. He learned that Taggart drank heavily on Saturday nights. He learned that the other overseer, a man named Pruitt, had been arguing with Beaumont about money and was likely to be fired soon. He learned that Catherine Beaumont sometimes sat alone in the parlor after dinner, staring at nothing, and that her maid Clara had scars that she tried to hide. And he found Solomon. It happened on a Sunday evening. Isaiah was walking near the cabins, pretending to stretch his legs, when he heard a low voice singing, "Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water, God's gonna trouble the water." The voice was old and cracked and barely audible. Isaiah followed the sound. He found an old man sitting outside a cabin, blind, his hands folded in his lap, singing to no one. Isaiah sat down next to him. He did not say anything for a long time. And then the old man said, without turning his head, "You're the new one. From Virginia." Isaiah said, "How did you know?" Solomon said, "Because you walk like a man who is counting steps. And you haven't looked up once since you got here. That means you're not here to survive. You're here to do something." Isaiah was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "I want to know about the oven." Solomon turned his ruined face toward the sound of Isaiah's voice. And for the first time in years, the old man smiled. What followed was a partnership that would change the history of Adams County. Every night for the next 5 months, Isaiah and Solomon met. Sometimes in Solomon's cabin. Sometimes in the woods behind the cotton gin. Sometimes in the root cellar of the main house, where Isaiah had discovered a loose board that gave access to a space no one used. They talked in whispers. They planned. And slowly, carefully, they began to bring others in. The first was a man named Caleb who worked in the stable. Caleb was huge, quiet, and had a reason to hate Beaumont that went beyond the usual. Beaumont had sold Caleb's wife to a plantation in Alabama 2 years earlier. Caleb had not seen her since. The second was a woman named Martha, who was the cook in the main house. Martha was 40 years old, sharp-tongued, and she had access to every room in Beaumont Hall, including Catherine's bedroom. The third was a young man named Samuel, who was only 19 but had the nerves of steel and could run faster than anyone on the plantation. And then there was Eliza. Eliza was 16. She had been at Beaumont Hall for only 8 months, sold from a plantation in Tennessee after her mother died. She was assigned to serve in the dining room, carrying trays, pouring wine, standing behind Catherine's chair during dinners. She was quiet. She was careful. She was invisible. And she was terrified, because Eliza had seen something she should not have seen. One night, carrying a tray of silver back to the kitchen, she had taken a wrong turn and ended up near the back of the property. She saw 2 men dragging someone toward the brick building. She heard screaming, and she ran. She ran so fast she dropped the tray. The silver scattered across the dirt. And the next morning, Taggart found the tray and reported it. Beaumont called Eliza into his office. He did not yell. He did not hit her. He just looked at her with those cold gray eyes and said, "You saw something last night, didn't you?" Eliza said nothing. She shook her head. Beaumont smiled. "Good, because if you did see something, you know where you'd end up. And you don't want that. Do you, Eliza?" She shook her head again. She was shaking so hard her whole body was trembling. Beaumont dismissed her. But the sentence was already decided. In his mind, Eliza was marked. One more mistake, one more wrong look, one more dropped tray, and she would go to the oven. Isaiah found out about Eliza through Martha. Martha told him the story while she was kneading bread in the kitchen, her hands moving fast, her voice low. "That girl is going to die, Isaiah. Beaumont has her name on a list. I've seen the list. He keeps it in his desk." Isaiah said, "Not if we move first." And that was the moment. That was the line. Because until then, Isaiah had been planning, calculating, waiting for the right moment. But Eliza was 16, and she was terrified, and she was one of them. And Isaiah knew that if he did not act now, he would lose the one thing that mattered more than strategy, more than timing, more than anything. He would lose his humanity. So he made the decision. Not with Solomon. Not with Caleb. Not with Martha. Alone. In the root cellar, by the light of a single candle, he decided that the night would come in August. "I want to stop right here and say something to you," If you have made it this far, you have stayed with me through some of the darkest chapters of American history. And I do not take that lightly. This story is not easy. It is not comfortable. But it is real. Every detail, every name, every moment of cruelty and courage, it all happened. And the fact that you are still here, still watching, still caring enough to want to know what happens next, that says something about you. So thank you, truly, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for staying. And I promise you with everything I have, the best part of this story is still to come. Do not go anywhere. August 14th, 1857. A Friday. The kind of Friday in Mississippi where the air is so thick you could chew it. The temperature was 96 degrees by noon. The cotton was white and heavy under a sun that had no mercy. The cicadas were screaming in the oaks. And at Beaumont Hall everything looked normal. Catherine Beaumont had been planning for weeks. Through Martha she had sent messages to Isaiah. Not written messages, never written. Spoken. Whispered. Martha would say things like, "The mistress says the silver needs polishing," which meant the house would be unguarded. Or, "The mistress wants the blue dress for church," which meant Catherine would be gone. The code was simple but effective, built on the one thing that slaveholders never suspected, that their own wives might be working against them. On that Friday morning, Catherine told Harlan she was taking the children to visit her sister in Natchez. She would be back Sunday night. Harlan did not look up from his ledger. He waved his hand. "Fine. Take the carriage. Tell Pruitt to drive you." But Catherine had already arranged for Pruitt to be sent to town early that morning to pick up supplies. The carriage driver would be a hired man named Joseph, who Catherine had paid $20, a fortune, to do exactly what she needed. He would drive her to Natchez, drop her at her sister's house, and then keep driving. Keep driving north, toward Memphis, toward freedom. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the carriage rolled out of Beaumont Hall. Catherine sat in the back with her 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 5. She did not look back. If she had looked back, she might have seen her husband standing on the porch, watching the carriage disappear down the dirt road, a glass of bourbon in his hand, already thinking about the evening ahead. Because Friday nights at Beaumont Hall were Harlan's nights. The overseers were paid on Fridays, and after they collected their money, they usually went to the tavern in Natchez to drink and gamble. Taggart always went. Pruitt had already left. That left only one overseer on the property, a young man named Dawes, who was 22, lazy, and more interested in the enslaved women than in doing his job. Isaiah knew all of this. He had counted every person on the plantation. He knew that at any given time on a Friday night, there would be no more than 3 white men on the property, and 2 of them would be drunk by 8 o'clock. At sundown, Isaiah gave the signal. It was a song, low, almost inaudible, coming from the direction of the east field. "Steal away to Jesus." The melody was simple, but the rhythm was specific. 3 notes, pause, 3 notes, pause. It meant, tonight. In the cabins, doors opened quietly. Men came out. Women came out. Children were left behind, told to stay silent, told to pray. 63 people moved through the darkness like shadows. They had been planning this for months. They knew the patrol routes. They knew where the dogs were kept. They knew that the fence on the north side had a section where the posts had rotted and could be pushed aside. At 8 o'clock, Harlan Beaumont was in his study. The bourbon bottle was half empty. He was in his shirt sleeves, his boots off, his feet on the desk. He was reading a letter from his lawyer about a land dispute, and he was annoyed. The room smelled of tobacco and leather and the particular mustiness of a man who had not opened a window in years. He did not hear the door open. Isaiah came in first, then Caleb, then Samuel. 3 men moving fast, moving quiet. Harlan looked up. For a moment he did not understand. His brain, fogged with bourbon, tried to process what he was seeing. 3 enslaved men standing in his study, unchained, uninvited. And then he saw Isaiah's eyes, and he understood. "You," Harlan said. "The Virginia man." Isaiah said nothing. He just stood there, looking at the man who had burned over 100 human beings, looking at the man who had sold wives from husbands, children from mothers. Looking at the man who thought he was a god, Harlan stood up. His hand went to the drawer where he kept his pistol. But Caleb was faster. One step, one hand, and the pistol was on the floor. Harlan backed against the wall. "You know what I'll do to you," Harlan said. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "You know what happens to niggers who do this." Isaiah took a step forward, and he said, in a voice so quiet that Harlan had to lean in to hear it, "You built something, Master, a place where you put people to burn. You made them walk into it. You made them suffer, and you called it justice." Harlan's face went white. Isaiah said, "Tonight, you're going to know your own creation." They took him out of the house, not through the front door, through the back, past the kitchen where Martha stood with her arms crossed, watching, past the cabins where the remaining enslaved people watched from their doorways, some crying, some praying, some just standing in silence. They walked him down the dirt path, past the cotton gin, past the smokehouse to the brick building. The Devil's Mouth. Taggart, the overseer, was found unconscious in the tavern in Natchez. He never knew what happened. Dawes, the young overseer, was found tied to a post in the barn, gagged, alive but terrified. He would later tell investigators that he heard nothing, saw nothing, knew nothing, which was a lie. But in Adams County in 1857, the word of a white man was worth more than the word of 100 enslaved people, so no one pressed him. What happened inside the brick building that night was never officially recorded. But the oral history, passed down through the families of those who were there, tells us this. Harlan Beaumont was placed inside. The iron grate was lowered, and the fire was lit. Not a slow fire, not the kind that Peter endured, not the kind that Solomon survived 3 times. A fire that burned hot and fast. Because Isaiah was not interested in making Harlan suffer for hours. He was interested in making him understand, in the final moments of his life, exactly what he had done to others. Old Solomon was brought to the building, blind, deaf in one ear, barely able to stand. They sat him on a chair outside the door, close enough to feel the heat. And Isaiah knelt beside him and said, "Solomon, it's done." The old man put his burned, twisted hands on Isaiah's face. He felt the shape of it, and he said, "God is good." By midnight the fire was out. The brick building was silent, and 63 enslaved people were walking north through the Mississippi darkness, following a route that Catherine had mapped out for them, a route that connected to a network of safe houses run by Quakers and free black families that stretched all the way to the Ohio River. They walked for 11 nights. They hid in barns and swamps and church basements. They were fed by strangers who risked their own lives. They were guided by people who had never met them but who believed, as Solomon believed, as Isaiah believed, that no human being should ever be another human being's property. 47 of them made it to Canada. The rest were captured along the way, sold, or died of exhaustion and disease. But 47 people who walked out of hell and into freedom. Catherine Beaumont arrived in Boston in September of 1857. She changed her name. She never spoke publicly about Beaumont Hall. She lived in a small house on Beacon Hill, worked as a seamstress, and raised her 2 children alone. She died in 1891, at the age of 73. On her deathbed, her daughter found a letter hidden under her mattress. It was addressed to no one. It said only, "I am sorry. I am sorry. I am sorry." Isaiah settled in Chatham, Ontario, where a thriving community of formerly enslaved people had built a life from nothing. He became a preacher. He married a woman named Ruth, ironically, the same name as the girl who had been burned in the oven years before. They had 4 children. And every Sunday, he would stand in the pulpit of the British Methodist Episcopal Church and tell the story of Beaumont Hall. Not as a story of revenge, as a story of survival. Solomon died in 1861, just as the Civil War began. He was perhaps 73 years old. He never saw freedom, but he died free in his mind, which was the only freedom that had ever mattered to him. His grandson, a man named Josiah, named after the boy with the broken legs, carried Solomon's story north and passed it down through generations. Beaumont Hall burned down in 1873. A kitchen fire, they said. But the old families of Adams County knew better. They said the house burned because it was full of ghosts. They said on quiet nights, if you stood near the ruins, you could still hear the oven. Not the fire, the screaming. The brick building, the Devil's Mouth, was the last thing to fall. It stood empty and blackened until 1902, when a historian from the University of Mississippi came to document the site. He found chains on the walls. He found bones in the ash pit. He found a child's shoe, size 4, pressed into the mortar between 2 bricks. He wrote a report. The report was filed in a state archive and forgotten for 60 years. In 1963, during the Civil Rights Movement, a young black woman named Clara Beaumont, great-great-granddaughter of Harlan's maid Clara, found that report. She read it. She wept. And she drove to Natchez, found the ruins of Beaumont Hall, and stood where the oven had been. She said later that she felt something she could not explain. Not anger, not sadness, something else. Something like the feeling you get when you know that the people who came before you suffered so that you could stand there, free on that ground. The ruins of Beaumont Hall are still there. You can visit them if you go to Natchez and drive south on the old road past the casinos and the riverboats, past the magnolias and the Spanish moss, until the road turns to dirt and the houses disappear. There is nothing left but foundations and a few brick walls and 2 oak trees that are still growing, twisted and dark, like they are still trying to strangle the memory of what happened there. But if you go on a quiet night, when the cicadas are loud and the air is thick and the Mississippi is running high, some people say you can still smell it. Not smoke, not ash, something worse. The smell of a man who thought he owned other human beings, learning too late that he owned nothing, not even his own soul. This story is not just about the past. It is about us, about what we allow, about what we ignore, about the line between comfort and cruelty, and how thin that line really is. Harlan Beaumont was not a monster. He was a man with power and no conscience. And that, more than any oven or any chain, is the most terrifying thing of all. Because monsters are easy to spot. Men like Harlan Beaumont are not. They smile at dinner. They shake your hand. They build beautiful houses with white columns and magnolia trees. And behind those columns, they burn people alive. So I ask you again, what do you think? Was what Isaiah did justice or vengeance? Is there a difference? And more importantly, if you had been there, in that cabin, in that darkness, with the oven glowing in the distance and your children sleeping behind you, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear every single answer. If the story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel something, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Hit the bell. Because we have more stories like this. Stories that the history books left out. Stories that someone somewhere is desperate for you to hear. And right now, the video on your screen, the one I picked just for you, that one is going to shake you even more. It is about a woman who escaped slavery by sewing herself into a crate and mailing it to freedom. Click it, watch it, and then come back and tell me which story hit you harder. I will see you in the next one.